I'm here today with Douglas Holwerda, an American psychotherapist living in Vietnam. And Douglas, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your current practice and background?
Yes, thank you for inviting me to participate in this, Jim. I'm glad to have this conversation with you being recorded. We've had some before this, and I've enjoyed our discussions. So, yeah, I'm an American psychotherapist, moved to Vietnam in 2010, have been working over here, and more recently have sort of semi-retired and live in Hoi An in Vietnam. I've also been working on and have completed an unpublished book that's relevant to the discussion we're going to have today. It's entitled Living from the Inside Out, and it's a sort of a look at our inner life and the psychology that makes up the way we function in the world, the ways that we draw on our inner experiences. So I'm sure we'll be talking about some of those ideas as we engage today. So.
Yeah, I feel fortunate to have been able to receive a copy of your book and read through it. And that really initiated the conversation today, is because there were a couple key things in your book that really draw my attention in relation to the work that I do in somatic therapies and helping clients to cultivate body awareness as part of a therapeutic process. And the two things in your book that really struck me the most and that I resonate with is understanding the purpose of the emotions and why they're there, or what the core lesson is that they have to teach us or to offer us. And that's something that I've been teaching to my clients for a lot of years, and it's a practice that I do on a regular basis myself when emotions come up, and I'm understanding why they're there and how I need to work with them or regulate them. So that's a topic that I want to spend some time in, and we'll probably start there. And one of the other things I want to discuss as well is the somatic therapies in general. And the way that I categorize it and write about it and teach it is that basically there's 4 methods that we can use at a body level to work with psychotherapeutic processes. And this is a bottom-up approach, which as an acupuncturist, one thing that we often encounter is we may be treating someone for neck pain or shoulder pain or elbow pain or something that appears very physical. And then we'll put in needles wherever, maybe in their feet or their legs, and then they have an emotional reaction or an opening or even a catharsis. And when I was early in clinical practice, that was a challenge to work with that, because my education didn't necessarily prepare me for working with people at that level. And so in years of looking into this and working with counselors and meeting with them and studying, I've been able to put together a system that has been readily available and accessible to other acupuncturists, as well as a system that's easy to learn. And the way that I categorize things is that there's 4 body-based or somatic methods that we can use. We can use the breath, or we can use movement and touch and sensory-related processes. Right. And the one that I want to spend more time on today are some of the sensory-related processes, because there's a lot of implications to that in terms of cultivating body awareness, but also in directing our attention away from our internal problems and feelings and externally becoming more aware of the environment can be a useful practice as well. So let's go back to the purpose of the emotions, and we can start with any emotion or even a condition like anxiety. So if we start with something such as fear or grief.
Before we dive into that, which I certainly want to do, let me just say that the model that I'm drawing on is one where there's a triad that I think of as our inner life, which includes thought, emotion, and body. And it's that triad where each one represents a source of information. Okay? And there's also an interface between each of those dualities. Our thoughts and our emotions create a conduit where communication occurs. The same thing is true with our emotions and our body, and our thoughts and our body. So there's a interface that represents all three of those parts. And you could say that they all represent a source of information.
Right.
So we can enter the process through any one of those three doorways. And
that's a good point.
Yeah. And so, but it's very important then if we highlight, say, the emotional entry point, that we're very aware of the access we can also attain, or even the healing that can come through working with the body or working with our thought process. Okay,
yeah.
I tend to enter through the door of emotions because as a psychotherapist, when people walk in the door, they're usually there because they're feeling some kind of an emotional pain or stress or confusion, and so it's often a really good place to find a connection and to start to identify what's going on. So now to move more specifically to what I think is very useful, which is to say that actual emotions are a positive part of our experience, and if we open ourselves to the emotions that get generated from the experiences that we're having, there's always something to gain and learn from what that emotion is. And while there's no sort of universal truth about how we might identify the purpose of each emotion, I think there's a value to assigning some purpose, and if it's not appropriate for someone else, that's fine. They can sort through what that might be for them.
Yeah, I found that to be a valuable thing in speaking about the purpose of the emotion with clients, because then that gives it a level of meaning.
Yeah.
And without purpose, then people can tend to get lost. And the emotions decide, or psychotherapeutic or therapeutic processes aside, if people have a purpose in their life, then generally they feel better and they have goals and ambitions and they're in a positive space. But if we don't have a purpose, generally speaking, or even therapeutically speaking, if we don't have a purpose, then I find that will often lead to adverse emotions or discomfort and various disorders.
Well, yeah, and even to assign the fact that, what's an organic experience of feeling emotion is actually our natural tendency to teach ourselves something. There's a beautiful sort of relationship between, how we learn in life and what it is that we experience emotionally or otherwise. And of course, there's some work to do in that realm. Emotional intensity is something we have to pay attention to, and so is emotional receptivity. In other words, we can repress emotions or restrict emotions in such a way that we're not fully receptive to what might be an appropriate feeling from a given situation. So, there's a field of learning that has to do with how we regulate, how we access, and how we then use what can be the purpose of what our emotions are there to tell us. So.
Yeah, that's a big topic, emotional regulation, and sometimes we need to dial up our emotions. Like if someone's in a state of apathy, then we think of that in Chinese medicine as a deficient condition, and
Yeah.
we have ways that we categorize these things.
Right.
Whereas if someone has anger problems and they need anger management, then typically they need to dial down their emotions and regulate by turning things down.
Right.
So emotional regulation, it's a really essential and fascinating topic. And I like in DBT the way that they categorize and move through the treatment. I believe emotional regulation is the third step in a four-step process in that system.
Right.
And with the somatic therapies, I like what you said too about the three-point triangle. And that's a method that I use to teach as well, both physical things that deal with acupuncture, and I also use it for things more on the mental side and the psychological side of things. So I like that system because I feel like it gives three-dimensionality
Yeah.
to whatever we're working with. So in your system then, you like to be aware of the body, the mind, and the emotions, and you use the emotions as the entry point because that's what clients are typically coming to see you for. Okay, that makes sense. One way I think about this too is that I've heard this from various sources, that there's the top-down approaches that start at the level of the mind or with cognition and understanding our behaviors from a mental perspective. But then these somatic therapies will start at the level of the body using breath, touch, movement, or sensory-oriented processes.
Right.
If you're entering the process through the emotions, I'm interested in what is it that creates that space between the emotions and the body? So if you're coming in through the emotions when you work with people, how do you access the wisdom in the body, and how do you work at a body level with your clients?
I do in a sort of elementary way. In other words, the conversations that ask questions about where do you feel this in your body, or how does it affect your body, or do you recognize the kind of feeling that it is as a visceral or a physical feeling.
Okay, great.
Those are questions that just help a person realize that yes, that conduit is a very real one, and that there's two levels to it. One might be what the experience is right here and now, and another is how it is that we might sort of bury our feelings in our bodies by creating physical dysfunctions or muscle memory or even posture that reflects shame or emotions that we've internalized. So there's a lot there. But because that hasn't become sort of my specialty, it's more likely that I will make reference to that or draw on that, but then I will encourage people to seek additional help by accessing people who know more, or by, ways of living in their bodies that are meant to be supportive of that. Okay, so of course yoga and different forms of engaging our body that then become part of what is helpful in the maintenance of this equation.
Yeah, physical practices like yoga can certainly be helpful.
That's right. But the truth is, I had a colleague that I made referrals to on a fairly regular basis in Hanoi because I knew what she knew, and her approach was body work and different energy works and ways in which people could access, as you say, the somatic side of the problem. And often that felt very complementary.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen that in clinical practice with people I've worked with, where some people are specialized in talking therapies and then others more so in the somatic therapies, which could involve just mostly exclusively working with movement as a form of a somatic therapy. And it's nice to have those systems in a shared space where you can refer to each other and recognize the strengths of each therapist that's present.
That's ideal because in order for us to be fully effective, we need to be able to work with and understand all three of these parts. Okay, and so having people that can pick up where we leave off, so to speak. The problem is that sometimes people who come in to see me aren't prepared to, take the whole next step. I mean, it's sort of like, okay, well, that's an option, or that might come later, or what's really nice is when there's community centers where these different approaches are collaborated, and somebody can go to one place and they can find access to all the resources that are going to be most helpful. So
yeah, that's an ideal situation.
Yeah,
not always possible.
Yeah.
I've done my best in my own practice to pick up the most practical, easy to use tools that fit specifically with acupuncture and the type of things that come up. And it's fairly common that people will come in for anxiety or depression, and they've maybe seen their doctor, or they're on medications, or maybe they've seen a counselor, or they're currently seeing one. Right. I think a lot of people will come in for acupuncture in relation to psychological conditions because of the benefits that it can give on a physical level, through alleviating pain, or through opening a person up in a cathartic type way, which it frequently does. And yeah, I could give you examples of many clients through the years that they knew that acupuncture was one of the best therapies that was available to them to address the physical symptoms that were connected to what was going on psychologically. That could be trauma, or it could be stress, or any number of other things. So you mentioned this method of having people locate their emotions in their body and feeling into the sensations. Is that something that you frequently use in your practice?
Probably most often for anxiety, because anxiety, there's almost a sort of predictable set of ways in which the human body, comes to deal with it, and
that fight or flight response.
Fight or flight, and it's muscle. It can be the digestive system. Often it's the chest and neck, and there's a tightness, locating that and having some descriptions and even sort of metaphoric terminology. So I can remember someone saying it's like an octopus is wrapped around my chest and neck, and it's got these tentacles and a grip, and that's useful for a variety of reasons. Number one, because it also externalizes the idea that this is happening to us. Emotions, while they're our emotions, we don't necessarily choose them. They're sort of the experience we're having. And so whenever we can sort of see it as something that's happening that might have a color, a shape, a size, a particular type of feeling, then that gives us a degree of separation from that. It gives us a sense.
Exactly.
Yep. Yes. And we can then observe it happening rather than being overwhelmed by the experience such that we just feel helpless in it. So I would say anxiety more than anything, but sadness also has some very physical kinds of feelings. Apathy, as you mentioned, which often is not an emotion that people think of. It's often sort of comes when people have lost hope. They've tried and tried and tried, and there's a point where that seems to wear out, and they give up. And there's a sense of a loss of of motivation and
Helplessness and
mhm.
yeah. Yeah, I certainly recognize that connection between apathy and helplessness or being hopeless.
Yeah.
You mentioned the octopus that one of your clients saw.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll frequently have this happen too, and when I ask people these sensory related processes and questions. And I'll typically start by asking something simple. So once they locate the anxiety, and I completely agree, that's what I found in my clinical practice as well, is that because it's related to the autonomic nervous system
Yeah.
and the fight or flight and freeze response, that people will typically feel anxiety in their chest and constriction and tightness. And when they locate it themselves in that area and they say, yes, I don't like to necessarily tell them that lots of people feel anxiety.
Yeah.
I like to have them locate it.
Yes.
Because other people do feel it in their
Different.
abdomen.
That's right.
Or they might feel it in their throat or somewhere else. So I like to be careful about the way that I take them into it and make sure that I don't say too much that may influence the way that they have the experience. And the first step really begins with having them locate it. And then I like to begin with those simple questions, like you said, like asking about the feeling, does it feel tight or constricted, or asking if there's any colors or shapes that are present. And in asking those very basic questions, it's very common that people will start to have these larger visual images start to appear, like you mentioned an octopus, or someone I was working with recently, they were working with grief, and they experienced like water within their chest, and it was a waterfall. But we went through the process, and initially the way they described the water, it was more of a depressive, grief-like quality to it. But then as we went through the process of asking these sensory-related questions and having them to describe the feelings and what senses were invoked, then that started to transform from this like stagnant, depressive type water into something that was flowing and beautiful, like a waterfall.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's where the magic and the metamorphosis starts to happen. So in terms of that process that I just described, with starting with basic questions like what's the size or the shape or the color or the basic feeling, do you want to elaborate on that? Like, do you have that as a goal necessarily, or when do you know that you've asked enough questions, or how do you recognize where the client is in the process and how to support them in that process?
It's a great question, and I think it's predicated on what I'll call an understanding that when we face rather than avoid an emotional experience or a pain, that somehow we go into it rather than deny it or avoid it. And it's by going into it that it gains that mobility, that it somehow shifts. Of course, it makes sense that we would rather avoid or deny an emotional pain, and so therefore we experience it, but we never truly face it or even go further into it, like what we described, what it looks like and feels like in our body.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually kind of a rare experience for somebody to be supported by a therapist like you or I, to be able to focus our attention and to go more deeply into what is that feeling.
Yeah.
Particularly when they're feeling safe and supported and empathized with, to be able to say, yes, this is a real thing, and your experience of it has a lot to it. Let's go there. Okay? And so it's predicated on the notion that when we fully accept the truth of what is, that then we gain the change and the transformation that is required. We starts to move again,
Yes.
versus the restriction of denial is where these feelings get locked into our body. We don't want to face it or experience it because it's painful. But then there it sits, you know, and
It gets stagnant.
it gets stagnant, exactly.
It's something we speak a lot about in Oriental medicine, is that the energy gets stagnant. And yeah, I completely agree that with repression or denial of the feeling or the emotion, like the repression and denial causes the stagnation. And in these processes then, when we have people describe their sensory experience and the feeling of it in their body, and that starts to move the energy in a way that causes shifts and openings and releases and movement in their life.
That's right.
When they leave the therapy session. And that's really powerful.
It seems simple in a way, but it's exactly the outcome that therapy is about. It's about movement, change, release, opening, letting go. All of those things that are dynamic in the ways that we go about living life. I mean, the truth is, change is inevitable. It's what we're experiencing all the time. Mm-hmm. And the degree to which we can flow along with the change that's occurring, rather than clinging on to something, you know, that gives us some control or gives us a way of feeling like we're avoiding the hard parts. That's the recipe for stagnation and stuckness and rigidity and fixed ways of being in the world. And yeah, eventually we lose our ability to be in the present, live, you know, alive to the moment, and open to what's coming, you know. So
yeah, you said a key word there, which was change. And you know, life is so full of it, and especially now in this modern world, things are moving so fast, and we really have to have that ability and flexibility and adaptability to be able to flow with the changes. And I've noticed in my own life and with my clients as well, is that the degree to which they're able to adapt to the current situation and flow with it is often connected to the degree of the condition that they have. So if they're not very adaptable, then that's going to cause problems. But if they do have flexibility and that ability to flow with the change, then things tend to go smoother for them. I want to get back to, we were talking about the sensory related processes and the purpose of the emotion. So one thing that I've taught my clients for a lot of years and that I speak to them about, typically I'll speak to them about if someone comes to me with a condition like grief, and perhaps they've lost a loved one or there's been a significant loss in their life. And typically that's the primary reason for grief. It has to do with losing something or someone and letting go of them. So I'll often have that conversation before I take them into locating it in their body. But not always. It depends on, you know, the dynamics of the session. Right. So with these two processes in particular, of having people locate the emotion and describe it in a sensory related way, and the underlying purpose of the emotion, like how do you dovetail those together in a session for a client with something like grief?
Well, I think it starts out with being able to identify that might be what it is that's occurring, and to be able to explain or offer some insight into what that process is. So, for example, we might say that grief is the process of accepting a loss. Okay, so there's three parts there. There's the loss, and then there's the process that leads to acceptance, full acceptance.
So acceptance is the outcome.
Acceptance is the outcome. So we could say that the grief is fully realized when we've accepted what that loss is. Okay?
Okay.
Now, the magnitude of the loss will also determine the kind of process it is. I mean, the truth is we don't want to accept the loss one day after it's occurred, okay? Because it's not honoring the truth or the magnitude of what the meaning of that loss is to us. So there's this, on one hand, it's a process that involves pain, sadness, and anger and frustration and things that represent our the way in which the loss is not a desired thing. So it's only when we're willing to sort of go through and identify these different feelings that are associated with that loss that we can then allow the process to be a change process rather than getting stuck or thwarted through avoidance or through indulgence, somehow or another having it be a less organic or dynamic process. You can't rush grief, nor should you ever try. You can simply open yourself up to the truth of what it is. Okay, and what I think often happens is that it attracts a lot of the other grief from losses that are part of life itself or part of previous experiences that we've had. So it's a very important way to understand not only ourselves but what matters to us in life, what it is that represents what we value and what has meaning to us. So I would say as a therapist, it's my role to hold that space and to guide that process by continually coming back to what those feelings are and then what sort of doors open when we start talking about those feelings. Often it might be memories or it might be unresolved dynamics with the person or the place or the situation that feels like the loss. So it's really being open to that process and helping us, again, just like we talked about, face and go into what's there rather than to deny or avoid what that might be. So
yeah, I like how you describe it as a process. There's a couple clients I'm thinking of right now that went through grief, and the process was very different but similar in some regards. And I think recognizing that process is really essential and not hurrying it along, because in one particular case it involved the death of a loved one.
Sure.
And it was very heavy. And then in the other client, just to contrast this, so that was a very clear event, and we went through numerous sessions doing acupuncture, but with something like that, I saw the client for other things as well, but I was fully aware of what was going on with a family member, and in something as severe as death, then it's a very specific incident that caused that. Comparing that to another client who suffered a loss of a different type, but perhaps equally as painful, what it did for this other person was it brought up all the other losses that they've had in their life.
That's right.
And you mentioned something about that, about how that can bring up other things in their history. And so I'm interested in that. When you see that happening, it wasn't the case with the first client necessarily. Like that was more of a, there was a death, it was a specific situation, and I never remember that person commenting on, other losses in their life. But if a client of yours has that, what does that tell you? Like, how do you work with that in the process if that reminds them of all these other losses?
Well, I support that process because I think in one way or another, what we're trying to do is make sense of this experience of life, and particularly of the truth of the experiences we're having. So, yeah, I find it's not that uncommon that something moves from a specific loss, like you say, it can be the death of someone that we love or that we knew, but then it seems to attract memories or experiences that are maybe similar but different, or it contextualizes the experience of life. Okay, it points us to the ultimate truth that life is finite, that it's inevitable that we're all going to die. And that question itself is full of interpretation and meaning. Well, what does that mean? What are the implications of recognizing the impermanence of the experience of life? And it can also then open up into deeper levels of understanding how pain or tragedy is juxtaposed with joy and pleasures, and how it can take us into these areas that are a bit more abstract and further removed from the specific of a loss into the way life is, the experience of pain or suffering or tragedy, undesirable outcomes, things that we would rather not be true, but that in fact are part of our human experience. So again, my role, I think, is to hold the space. Sometimes I use a metaphor that, if somebody comes in to see me and they see me in a room that's already cluttered with things and there's not much space for what they have to share, then they're only going to share with me what they feel like I have space for. But if metaphorically I have a large room with a lot of space for them to open up to the depths of what they're thinking and feeling, then that process is part of the dynamic change that we're talking about. And that's actually what therapy is about. So my context is to say there's room for anything and everything that you might bring to therapy, and sometimes it's these deeper questions about, why do we suffer, or what is it that makes life worth living,
Yeah, often those big questions will come up, and especially when working with grief and major losses like that. Yeah. Absolutely, the metaphysical side of it. What is the meaning of life, and how do we find our meaning once again when a significant loss has been experienced?
A lot of times what we find out in the process is how fluid or flexible or open or adaptable a person has learned to live, and the opposite of which is controlled or fixed or restricted or restrained in some way or another. And I often find that it's people who have avoided pain or have used their own willpower or their own methods of controlling things that find it the most difficult to be receptive to painful or difficult things when they occur.